Welcome to the Natural Super Kids podcast, where you will discover practical strategies to inspire you to boost the health and nutrition of your kids. I'm Jessica Donovan, a qualified naturopath specialising in kids' health, and I want to make it as easy as possible for you to raise healthy and happy kids. Let's get into it. As if eczema and allergies were not complicated enough, we can throw in things like histamine intolerance and mast cell activation syndrome or mast cell dysregulation, and things become even more complex. So if you're listening and you're wondering why your child is reacting to everything, there's no clear patterns here, maybe they have been already diagnosed with histamine intolerance or mast cell dysregulation or even mast cell activation syndrome, we are going to talk about this from a natural, holistic perspective in today's episode. So we see a lot of parents and support a lot of parents who have very messy, murky allergy pictures in their kids. As I said, allergies are hard enough to navigate when they're clear and when we know that our child is reacting to a certain thing. But when there's this messy picture, when there's issues with histamine and mast cells, it can be really complicated, even in terms of getting a diagnosis correctly. And these kids are often reacting to not just multiple foods, but things like heat or stress, or even, sweat and exercise, seemingly random things. Allergy testing might have already been done and it's been, nothing's come back clearly in an allergy test, but something is clearly going on. This child is clearly reacting to something. Today I do want to focus on these two issues that are, that we commonly see in kids, but are on the more uncommon end of the spectrum when it comes to allergies. So let's talk about histamine intolerance first. So I think it's really important to note that histamine is normal in a body. We all produce histamine. So histamine isn't the issue, and the body is producing and breaking down histamine constantly. The problem arises when the breakdown of histamine cannot keep up with the load of histamine. And this is where there's a particular enzyme, we'll call it DAO. This is the enzyme that breaks down dietary histamine. So if your child's been diagnosed with histamine intolerance or you've done any research on histamine intolerance, you would have come across this enzyme DAO. So yes, DAO is important. It breaks down that dietary histamine. And in some people, a deficiency or a lack of this enzyme is a really big problem. But it is more than that. DAO is just one piece of the puzzle. Things like gut health, surprise, surprise, nutrient status, inflammation, the gut microbiome, these all influence the breakdown of histamine as well. Now, histamine comes from food, so there are high histamine foods, which we'll talk about in a moment, but your immune system also produces histamine, and your gut bacteria produces histamine as well. So we can have histamine coming in from all these different places that can fill up the bucket quickly. And just as a quick recap, if you're not familiar with high histamine foods, they are foods that are things like aged cheeses, fermented foods, leftovers are all high in histamine. So you can see that pattern of anything that's aged or fermented, which of course, in our industry, we are promoting and encouraging kids to eat fermented food. So if you've noticed, hang on a minute, when my child eats fermented foods that is supposed to help their gut health, their symptoms are getting worse, then that can be a sign that they have issues with histamine. Leftovers, as I said, but even some fruits and vegetables, avocado, spinach, tomatoes, citrus, strawberries, vinegar, are all high histamine foods as well. So the way we approach histamine intolerance is, yes, to reduce the histamine load. So that can mean reducing those high histamine foods in the diet for a period of time. But we also want to improve the breakdown of histamine, which, as I said, includes, yes, improving often and promoting levels of DAO, but also, working on that gut microbiome, working on those inflammation levels, and, things like stress can have an impact as well. So let's talk about mast cell activation syndrome next. So this is quite complex, but I guess I want to try and explain this in a simplified way. So mast cells are a type of immune cells, and they live in various parts of the body. They live in the gut, they live in the skin, they live in the airways, and they are like first responders when it comes to the immune system. So they are a big important part of immune system and the way that our body responds to threats. They act, as I said, like first responders to the environment, and they release histamine. They also release other inflammatory chemicals like prostaglandins and cytokines. So when mast cells are overactive, which is what they are in mast cell activation syndrome, the symptoms can go beyond just histamine issues. And I do want to be careful here because there is mast cell activation syndrome, which is relatively uncommon in kids. But what is more common is mast cell dysregulation. So it might not be full-blown mast cell activation syndrome, but some sort of dysregulation with the mast cells is fairly common. And sometimes, there can be there's no clear kind of parameters when it comes to diagnosis of these conditions and issues either. So there can be some misdiagnosis, some overdiagnosis, and sometimes some underdiagnosis as well. So it can be quite a complicated and messy sort of area. But when it comes to mast cell dysregulation or mast cell activation syndrome, there can be some overlaps with histamine intolerance. But basically what's happening is the mast cells are firing too easily. They're releasing histamine, they're releasing other inflammatory chemicals as well. And sometimes this can happen even without a clear trigger. So it's not necessarily about figuring out what is causing the reaction. It's more about how the body is responding. And there's a multi-system involvement when it comes to mast cell dysregulation. There's often skin issues and gut issues and respiratory issues and mood, behavior, sleep issues as well. And a big, differentiator when it comes to mast cell dysregulation is that triggers can be not food or even sort of those typical environmental triggers like dust and pollen that we think about. Triggers can be things like hot or cold or exercise or stress or strong smells, infections. Reactions are unpredictable. A child can be fine one day when exposed to certain things and then reactive the next day when exposed to those same things. So you can see how there can be a lot of confusion when it comes to diagnosis and figuring out what's going on with your child. And as I said, true mast cell activation syndrome, it's not, commonly diagnosed in kids, although it is becoming more common. Mast cell overactivity or dysregulation is something we do see commonly in kids or more commonly in kids. And especially when it comes to kids with eczema, allergies, gut issues, chronic inflammation, which are the sort of kids we unfortunately do see regularly. So an important thing to understand is that allergy testing, standard allergy testing, IgE, blood testing or skin prick testing will not pick up or identify histamine intolerance or mast cell activation because they are operating through completely different pathways. It's not a allergic reaction as such. So a normal allergy test won't show anything up, but it doesn't mean that nothing's wrong because clearly there is something going on in these kids. So if reactions are consistent, immediate, they're clearly linked to one or two foods, then it's an allergy or one or two environmental triggers as an example. But if symptoms are variable, things feel layered and complicated and messy, there's multiple triggers, then it could be histamine. There could be histamine and mast cell or mast cell involvement. So some things to think about if this sounds like your child, or some practical takeaways if you like. So it's always important to zoom out. So rather than looking at the specific triggers, if your child seems to be reactive and there isn't a clear picture, zoom out and think about what else was going on in that day. Was there stress? What was your child's sleep like? Did they have some sort of virus or illness? What was going on in their environment? Was it hot? Was it cold? What sort of food combinations were they eating? Yes, a food and symptom diary can be somewhat helpful, but it can be really hard for you to navigate this alone. So as well as tracking, food, also track those other things, the sleep, the illness, the stress, and, really importantly for these sort of complex allergy pictures is you want to make sure you're getting support from a holistic practitioner that will look at the whole picture. A lot of families will go through GPs and specialists without getting the support that they really need, or the answers that they're looking for, or any real answers at all. So know that a more holistic practitioner can be really helpful, because our real specialty is zooming out and looking at the whole picture, holistic picture, which unfortunately the modern medical model doesn't do that well. So, it can get really confusing if you're trying to just look at foods and symptom pictures. You can start blaming random foods that really aren't the problem. Now, a low histamine diet can be helpful, but we want to make sure that we're, trialing this as a way to figure out, is histamine an issue here? So, following a low histamine diet can definitely be helpful, but we don't want our kids to be on a low histamine diet for, really long lengths of time, because while it can reduce the symptoms, it can also really impact the amount of variety and diversity that your child is having, which can worsen gut health and gut microbiome health, which is often, needing a bit of attention for these kids as well. So the low histamine diet really it's not the solution. It's a tool to help you navigate, whether this might be an issue for your child, and to reduce the symptoms short term. So we really want to be thinking beyond histamine. We don't just want to be reducing histamine and that's that. We want to be thinking more broadly. And especially if mast cells are involved, if there is that mast cell picture going on, we don't just want to be lowering histamine. We need to be looking at calming the immune system, supporting the gut, reducing that overall inflammatory load. And interestingly, this is the exact approach that we take when it comes to kids with eczema and allergies anyway. So even though the picture of a child that is struggling with histamine intolerance or mast cell activation syndrome or dysregulation is very different than a child who has a diagnosed allergy or an intolerance or a sensitivity, what I love so much about naturopathy and a holistic approach is often the underlying things that we're working on are exactly the same. So that, can be really helpful to know. And the other thing I want to say here is supplements can be helpful. So things like quercetin, antihistamines, like whether they're natural antihistamines or pharmaceutical antihistamines, obviously more medical than supplements. Even, DAO supplements, they can be helpful. But again, they're not the whole picture. They're not the whole solution. We really need to be looking at the gut microbiome, underlying inflammation, that overactive immune system, calming that down. So we really need to be working on those drivers first and foremost. Yes, supplements can be helpful, but they are not the be all and end all either. So really at the crux of it, histamine intolerance, mast cell dysregulation, IgE allergies, food allergies, environmental allergies, eczema. We really approach all of these things in a very similar way, which is working on that immune reactivity, the gut function in general, gut microbiome, reducing inflammation. And so that is good news for parents, that yes, it's complicated and it's complex, but the way we approach these complex issues isn't necessarily complex. It really comes down to, like most things that we are looking at with kids, immune health and gut health are really the cornerstones of so many of the things that we commonly see in kids, whether it's eczema, allergies, histamine intolerance, mast cell dysregulation. And so I hope this episode has helped you understand or think about these issues in a different way. Maybe it's made you think, oh my gosh, that's my child, or maybe your child's already been diagnosed with one of these issues and you felt a bit lost in terms of how to approach it. We can definitely support you. We offer online consultations in our online clinic, which is super convenient. And we have a eczema and allergy masterclass coming up that is really relevant for kids with histamine issues and mast cell dysregulation as well. So I would highly recommend that you sign up. If we are in the period, like in terms of if you're listening to this at the time that we are enrolling people or promoting our free masterclass, you will find the link to that in the show notes, and you'll probably hear me talk about it somewhere else in this episode as well. If not, definitely come on over to our website, naturalsuperkids.com. You can find different ways to work with us on there, and you can reach out to us on Instagram at naturalsuperkids as well if you have any questions. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll be back with another episode next week. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. Head on over to our website, naturalsuperkids.com, for the show notes for this episode, as well as a whole heap of inspiration to help you raise healthy and happy kids. I'll see you next week.